History books often focus on the clash of empires, but the Siege of Quebec reveals a far more brutal adversary, nature itself. This wasn't merely a fight between French and British forces, it was a desperate struggle against sheer rock, unforgiving currents, and the chilling grip of an imminent winter. Discover how the land decided who won and who perished. In the summer of 1759, the fate of North America hung suspended above the dark, churning waters of the St. Lawrence River. To the casual observer, the conflict appeared to be a standard collision of 18th century superpowers, the expansive, trade-driven ambition of Great Britain engaging the entrenched, aristocratic might of France. But the true protagonist of this drama was neither King George nor King Louis. It was the geography of the New World. At the heart of this geographic conflict stood Quebec City. It was not merely a settlement, it was a geological anomaly, a fortress born of ice and stone, designed by nature for defense. The city did not sit upon the land, it loomed over it. The upper town was perched atop the Cap Diamant, a massive promontory of slate and granite rising over 300 feet sheer above the convergence of the St. Lawrence and St. Charles rivers. To any approaching enemy, it was less a city and more a monolith, a Gibraltar of North America that stared down with cold indifference at the puny wooden ships attempting to navigate the waters below. The French, commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm, understood this advantage intimately. They knew that the cliffs were not their only shield. The river itself acted as a treacherous, swirling moat. Below the city lay the Traverse, a complex, twisting channel of jagged shoals and unpredictable currents. It was a maritime graveyard waiting to claim the hulls of the uninitiated. For decades, the French pilots had guarded the secrets of this channel, and as the British fleet approached, the French took the precaution of removing all navigational aids. Buoys were cut loose, markers were destroyed. The French leadership bet heavily on the river, convinced that the treacherous waters would tear the Royal Navy apart before a single cannon could be fired in anger. From the ramparts of the upper town, the view was one of supreme, terrifying dominance. To the east lay the Beauport Flats, a stretch of tidal mud and sand that constituted the only obvious landing zone. But even here, the earth had been weaponized. Montcalm had ordered the construction of extensive earthworks and redoubts along this shoreline, effectively turning the mudflats into a pre-calculated kill zone. Nature had funneled any would-be attacker into this specific corridor, where the combination of difficult footing and concentrated French musketry promised a massacre. For the British, the approach to Quebec was a journey into a geographic nightmare. The dense forests surrounding the region were ancient and suffocating, concealing irregular fighters and making traditional European maneuvers impossible. The winding pathways were narrow, forcing armies to string out in vulnerable lines, and hovering over every strategic decision was the inevitable ticking clock of the Canadian seasons. The British commanders knew that the St. Lawrence was not an open door, it was a closing jaw. By late autumn, the river would freeze, locking any trapped ships in a crushing embrace of ice. The campaign was not just a battle for ground, it was a race against the winter, as the massive British fleet, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors, slowly picked its way up the river, sounding the depths with desperate caution. They were not just sailing into enemy territory, they were sailing into a trap set by the earth itself. The French looked down from their heights, secure in the knowledge that their city was unassailable, protected by the rushing river, the towering cliffs, and the impenetrable forests. They believed the geography had already won the war, but they had not accounted for the sheer, grinding desperation of the man leading the British forces, nor for the fatal complacency that such perfect terrain can breed in the minds of defenders. As the humid heat of July settled over the St. Lawrence, the British campaign began to stagnate in the face of Quebec's imposing geography. Major General James Wolfe, the man charged with unlocking this fortress, found himself engaged in a battle not just with the French army, but with his own failing body and the unforgiving landscape. Racked by kidney stones and rheumatism, Wolfe was a man in varying degrees of physical agony, pacing his camp with a feverish intensity. He spent his days staring across the river at the grey stone walls of Quebec, which seemed to mock his every calculation. The British forces spent the summer battering their heads against the natural defences Montcalm had so astutely utilised. Every probe, every skirmish, confirmed the French commander's confidence. The frustration culminated on the 31st of July at Montmorency Falls, a disaster that nearly broke the spirit of the expedition. Here, the terrain was the undisputed victor. Wolfe ordered an assault on the French lines, entrenched along the high ground near the falls. But the geography did not cooperate. The British troops had to navigate slippery, mud-slicked tidal flats at low tide, moving towards steep slopes that were turned into a quagmire by a sudden, violent summer thunderstorm. As the grenadiers struggled for footing on the rain-soaked slopes, their discipline dissolved into chaos. Their powder was wet, rendering muskets useless, while French defenders rained fire down from dry, fortified positions above. The assault collapsed in a bloody heap of mud and red uniforms. The retreat was humiliating, covered only by the torrential rain that obscured the French aim. It was a stark lesson. A frontal assault against prepared positions on this terrain was suicide. The cliffs and the weather were fighting for France. August arrived, bringing with it the cool winds that signalled the approaching end of the campaigning season. The spectre of winter loomed large in the minds of the British command. If the river froze before the city fell, the fleet would be crushed or forced to depart, leaving the army stranded and starving. Wolfe, bedridden for days at a time, grew desperate. His letters home revealed a man staring into the abyss of failure, contemplating the ruin of his reputation. But desperation breeds innovation. With the obvious approaches at Beauport proven deadly, Wolfe turned his gaze upstream, past the city, to the cliffs that Montcalm deemed impenetrable. Reconnaissance missions became frantic, scouring the riverbanks for any weakness in the armour of the Cap Diamant. It was during these desperate surveys that a crucial piece of geographic intelligence emerged, possibly gleaned from Robert Stobo, a British prisoner who had escaped French custody, or from the sharp eyes of Wolfe's own scouts. They identified a narrow, jagged fissure in the cliff face southwest of the city, at a place called Anse-au-Foulon. To the naked eye, it was nothing more than a scrub-covered scar in the rock, a goat path so steep and narrow that it seemed impossible for a formed body of troops to ascend. It rose 175 feet from the riverbank to the plateau above, a vertical challenge that required hands and feet to climb. Because the terrain appeared so impassable, the French had grown complacent. The precipice was guarded by only a small detachment of militia, under the command of Captain Vergor, a man whose vigilance was as relaxed as the French command's trust in the cliffs. Wolfe saw in this geographic anomaly a glimmer of hope. Where Montcalm saw a wall, Wolfe saw a ladder. It was a terrifying gamble. To exploit this weakness, he would have to move his army under the cover of darkness, navigate the treacherous currents without being detected, and then physically haul thousands of men up a cliff face before the sun rose. If they were discovered halfway up, it would be a massacre. If the current swept them too far downstream, they would land directly under the guns of the city. But the geography left him no other choice. The river, the cliffs, and the coming winter had narrowed his options to this single, audacious roll of the dice. On the night of September 12, 1759, the British Army entrusted its existence to the very tides that had previously barred their way. The operation began in a suffocating silence, the air thick with the humidity of early autumn. Under the cloak of a moonless sky, thousands of soldiers boarded a fleet of flat-bottomed landing craft stationed upstream. These boats were not powered by oars, the rhythmic splashing of which would have echoed across the water like a warning bell. Instead, Wolfe utilised the river's current, allowing the force of the St. Lawrence to carry his army silently downstream toward the sleeping city. It was a masterpiece of deception fueled by desperate intelligence. The British knew that the French defenders were expecting a convoy of provision barges to slip downriver that night to resupply the garrison. Wolfe's flotilla became a phantom of this supply run. As the dark shapes drifted past the looming shadows of the French shore, the tension was palpable. Every creak of timber, every cough suppressed by a soldier, threatened to undo months of campaigning. At one point, a French sentry, peering into the gloom from the shoreline, called out a challenge to the passing boats. In a moment that balanced the fate of the continent on a razor's edge, a Highland officer in the lead boat, fluent in French, responded. He hissed back a warning to be quiet, claiming they were the expected provisions and that the English would hear them if the sentry raised an alarm. The ruse worked. The sentry, accepting the deception, let the enemy drift past, unaware that the belly of the wooden beast passing him was filled not with grain, but with grenadiers and light infantry. The boats ground ashore at the narrow strip of pebbled beach at Anse-au-Foulon just before 4 a.m. The towering cliff face rose above them, a black wall dissolving into the night sky. This was the moment where the geography demanded its toll. There was no path for an army here, only a rugged, twisting goat track obstructed by fallen trees and abatis. The vanguard, composed of hand-picked volunteers from the light infantry, slung their muskets across their backs and began the ascent. It was not a march, it was a scramble. Men pulled themselves up by tree roots, grasped at jagged outcroppings of shale, and hauled their bodies through the thick brush. The physical exertion was immense, a silent battle against gravity in pitch darkness. A single slip, a dislodged rock tumbling down, could have alerted the guard at the top. But the noise of the wind in the trees and the river below masked the sounds of their struggle. At the summit, Captain Vergor and his small detachment of French militia were asleep, lulled into a false sense of security by their faith in the terrain. They believed the cliff was its own sentry. They woke not to the sunrise, but to the terrifying sight of British infantrymen pulling themselves over the lip of the precipice, emerging from the abyss like spectres. The brief, confused skirmish that followed was decisive. The French guard was overrun, scattering into the darkness or surrendering. With the precipice secured, the signal was flashed down to the beach. The main body of the army began to land. The narrow path was cleared of obstacles, and a human chain formed to hoist artillery and supplies up the slope. Throughout the remainder of the night, the impossible became reality. Regiment after regiment, the scarlet coats of the British line infantry defied the vertical landscape, pouring onto the plateau above. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, nearly 4,500 British soldiers stood on the level ground west of the city. They had conquered the cliff. Now they waited for the French. Miles away to the east, at the Beauport lines, the Marquis de Montcalm was awake, his eyes scanning the grey dawn for a threat that was not there. For weeks, the French commander had been engaged in a mental chess match with Wolfe, but his focus was locked entirely on the riverbanks below his own feet. Throughout the night, British ships had staged a noisy, theatrical diversion off the Beauport shore, firing cannons and lowering boats, calculated specifically to fix Montcalm's attention on the mudflats. The ruse had worked to perfection. Montcalm had kept his boots on, his horses saddled, and his best troops, the Troupes de la Marine and the French regulars, standing to arms in the damp trenches, waiting for a landing that would never come. When the first breathless messenger arrived from the city, stammering reports of redcoats on the heights, Montcalm was incredulous. The news seemed physically impossible, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. In his mind, the cliffs to the west were an absolute barrier, a wall that nature had built to guarantee the city's safety. He had famously remarked that unless the enemy had sprouted wings, they could not ascend those heights. To accept the messenger's report was to accept that the fundamental laws of his world had been broken. Mounting his horse, Montcalm rode hard toward the city, accompanied by his staff, expecting to find perhaps a small raiding party that had slipped through the perimeter, a nuisance to be swatted away by the local garrison. But as he crested the high ground near the city walls and looked out across the plateau, the blood must have drained from his face. There, stretched across the plains of Abraham, was not a raiding party, but a fully formed British army. The thin red line was already deployed, their scarlet uniforms stark against the autumn grass and the grey sky. They were silent, organised, and terrifyingly still. The shock of the sight was the product of a fatal blind spot. Montcalm had trusted the terrain too much. He had fallen victim to a Maginot mentality, believing that a natural obstacle rendered a sector safe, allowing him to strip it of defences. That reliance on the cliffs had left the western approach naked, save for the sleeping militia at the cove. Compounding the disaster was the splintering of the French forces. Colonel Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, commanding a mobile column of elite troops tasked with shadowing British movements along the river, was nowhere to be seen. He was miles upstream at Cap Rouge, exhausted from chasing British decoy ships that had dragged him back and forth along the river all night. The geography that Montcalm had relied on to protect him now worked against him. The rugged, winding roads meant that Bougainville's reinforcements were hours away, unable to close the distance in time to alter the coming collision. Confusion reigned within the French command. The Governor-General, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, whose relationship with Montcalm was toxic and dysfunctional, offered little in the way of coordinated support. Orders were shouted, countermanded, and lost in the chaos. The French army, which had spent the night braced for an attack in the east, was now forced to turn around and run toward the west. They streamed back toward the city, a disorganized mass of white-coated regulars, Canadian militia in hunting shirts, and indigenous allies. They were winded, confused, and arriving piecemeal to a battlefield they had never anticipated defending. Montcalm now faced a torturous decision. He could wait behind the city walls for Bougainville to march down from the west and trap Wolfe between two fires, a siege tactic that might starve the British out. Or he could attack immediately, before the British could entrench themselves and bring up heavy artillery that would smash the city walls to dust. Looking at the British line, standing insolently on the open ground of the plains, Montcalm felt the pressure of the moment. He feared that if he waited, the British foothold would become a fortress. Abandoning the defensive advantage the city walls provided, he ordered his breathless, disorganized troops to form up outside the gates. He would meet Wolfe on the open field, a decision that would strip away the French advantage of irregular warfare and play directly into the hands of British discipline. The stage for the final act was a tract of land that belonged to a farmer named Abraham Martin. To a European general, the plains of Abraham were a gift, a relatively flat, open plateau that stretched westward from the city walls. For months, the British had struggled in the claustrophobic confines of dense forests and muddy tidal flats, terrain that broke up their formations and neutralized their greatest strength: rigid, mechanical discipline. But here, on this high, grassy plain, the geography finally leveled the playing field. The lands stripped away the ambiguity of the wilderness. There were no trees to hide behind, no ravines to ambush from. It was a killing floor, stark and exposed. Wolfe understood the geometry of the ground perfectly. He knew he was outnumbered, but the width of the plateau allowed him to improvise. In a standard European battle, infantry formed 3 ranks deep to maintain volume of fire. Wolfe, needing to cover the entire width of the plain to prevent being outflanked, stretched his line thin. He ordered his men to form only 2 ranks deep. It was a fragile, thin red line, extending across the plateau, its flanks anchored by the cliff edge on the right and scrubby woods on the left. If the French punched through, the British would be driven into the river. But the open ground meant the British officers could see every movement, controlling their men with voice and drumbeat, a luxury denied to them in the woods below. As the French army surged out of the city gates, the contrast in discipline was immediately apparent. Montcalm's force was a hybrid creature, a mix of white-coated professional regulars and Canadian militia accustomed to guerrilla warfare. On the open ground, This mixture proved fatal. The militia, trained to fire individually and take cover, began to lie down or drift toward the flanks to snipe at the British. The regulars tried to maintain a rigid column. The result was a disjointed, undulating wave of humanity that lost cohesion with every step. They began firing at the British line from over 100 yards away, a distance at which smoothbore muskets were effectively useless noisemakers. The British response to this ragged, shouting advance was a terrifying silence. Wolfe had ordered his men to load their muskets with 2 balls each, a heavy, double-shotted load designed for massive trauma at close range. But the order was to hold fire. The soldiers stood like statues, the gaps in their ranks torn by French sniping, immediately filled by the next man in line. This supernatural stillness in the face of an onrushing enemy was the psychological weapon of the professional soldier. It unnerved the French, who were shouting and firing wildly as they closed the distance. The geography of the plain became a measuring stick for death. The British waited. 70 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards. The French were now close enough that the British could see the whites of their eyes and the sweat on their faces. At 40 yards, point-blank range, the order finally shattered the silence. Fire! The result was not a ripple of shots, but a single, deafening crash that sounded like the detonation of a cannon. Because the ground was flat and the line was straight, every musket fired in perfect unison. A wall of lead slammed into the French columns. The double-shotted volleys tore through the white coats, shattering bones and collapsing the front ranks instantly. The smoke from the black powder hung thick in the air for a moment, trapped by the humidity, before drifting aside to reveal the catastrophe. The French army had been stopped dead in its tracks. The front lines were obliterated, dissolved into a writhing mass of casualties. The psychological shock was absolute. The survivors, stunned by the ferocity of the close-range volley, wavered. The British line, moving with the precision of a machine, reloaded, advanced a few paces through the smoke, and fired again. The cohesion of Montcalm's force disintegrated. The open plain, which had offered them a clear path to the enemy, now offered them nowhere to hide. The retreat began not as a tactical withdrawal, but as a panic-stricken rout back toward the city walls. The geography of the plains, once a farmer's field, had just facilitated one of the most efficient slaughters in military history. The engagement on the Plains of Abraham lasted less than 20 minutes, a violent spasm of musketry that decided the fate of an empire. But as the smoke drifted away on the river breeze, it revealed that the open terrain had exacted a heavy price from the architects of the battle. The very flatness of the field, which had allowed the British to unleash their devastating volleys, also meant there was no shelter for the commanders who led from the front. The plateau became an altar upon which both generals were sacrificed. Major General James Wolfe had stood conspicuous on the right of the British line, a tall, spindly figure in a bright new scarlet coat, an irresistible target against the backdrop of the grey sky. Throughout the campaign, he had been a man haunted by illness, but in the heat of battle, he was animated by a reckless courage. The geography offered him no redoubt, no trench, and no tree for cover. He had chosen to stand in the open, sharing the danger with his grenadiers. Early in the fight, a ball had shattered his wrist, which he bound with a handkerchief, refusing to leave the field. As the critical charge began, a second ball struck him in the stomach, and moments later, a third pierced his chest. The architect of the ascent, the man who had stared at the cliffs for months until he found a way up, collapsed on the very ground he had seized. He was carried a few yards to the rear, where he lay gasping on the turf. As his vision faded, he heard a soldier cry out, "They run! See how they run!" When told it was the French breaking, Wolfe issued one final order to cut off their retreat, then turned on his side and murmured, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He died knowing his gamble had paid off, his body resting on the captured plateau that would secure his legend. Across the field, the scene was one of tragic symmetry. The Marquis de Montcalm, swept up in the chaotic tide of his retreating army, tried desperately to rally his broken forces near the St. Louis Gate. The geography here turned against him once more. The narrow gates created a bottleneck, funneling the panicked French soldiers into a dense, crushing mass. As Montcalm rode through this crush, trying to maintain order, a spray of canister shot from a British cannon or a musket volley tore into his back. He did not fall immediately. Slumped in his saddle, bleeding profusely from a mortal wound to the abdomen, he was supported by 2 soldiers as his horse passed through the city gates. The women of Quebec, watching the disaster unfold from the windows, cried out, "The Marquis is dead!" He raised his head briefly to assure them he was not, but the truth was written in his pallor. He was carried to the house of a surgeon, where he was told his wound was fatal. "So much the better," he replied. "I shall not live to see the surrender of Quebec." He died the next morning at dawn, buried in a crater inside the Ursuline Chapel caused by a British shell, a grave dug by the enemy's artillery. The battle had effectively decapitated both armies. The British were left victorious but leaderless on the high ground. The French were defeated and demoralized within the walls. The geography of the Plains of Abraham had proven to be the great equalizer, stripping away rank and strategy to leave 2 dying men on opposite sides of a field, both victims of the war for the river. The British now held the keys to the continent, but the cost had been the life of the only man who knew how to turn the key. As night fell over the corpse-strewn field, the reality of the situation set in. The battle was won, but the war for survival was just beginning. The British were now masters of Quebec, but they were also prisoners of its geography, trapped between a hostile interior and a river that was rapidly turning to ice. The smoke over the Plains of Abraham cleared to reveal a city that had been battered into submission. But the British victory was far from secure. The surrender of Quebec City on September 18th was not the end of the struggle. It was merely a change of tenants in a house besieged by nature. The British Army, now commanded by Brigadier General George Townshend following Wolfe's death, marched into the shattered streets of the upper town. They found a ruin. Months of British artillery bombardment from across the river had reduced nearly 80% of the city's buildings to rubble. The stone walls that had looked so formidable from the river were now cracked and unstable. But the true enemy was no longer the French army, which had retreated upriver to Montreal to lick its wounds and regroup. The true enemy was the Canadian winter. As October turned to November, the geography of the St. Lawrence exerted its final, terrifying power. The river, the lifeline that had brought the British fleet to the city's doorstep, began to congeal. The great warships of the Royal Navy, terrified of being crushed by the ice, weighed anchor and departed for England, taking with them the promise of reinforcement and supply. The British garrison, consisting of about 7,000 men, was left behind, isolated on the frozen cliff. They were stranded in a hostile land, surrounded by a French population that viewed them as heretics and invaders. The temperature plummeted to levels the British soldiers, accustomed to the damp mildness of Europe, could scarcely comprehend. The stone buildings of Quebec, designed to keep heat in, now felt like tombs. The firewood supply was critically low, forcing soldiers to scavenge the frozen forests where indigenous raiding parties waited in ambush. Scurvy, the ancient scourge of trapped armies, began to stalk the garrison. Lacking fresh vegetables and fruit in the frozen wasteland, the men weakened. Their guns swelled, their teeth loosened, and old wounds from the campaign reopened. By the spring of 1760, nearly 1,000 British soldiers had died, not from French muskets, but from malnutrition and the biting cold. The geography that Wolfe had conquered was now extracting a brutal tax for the occupation. Yet, despite the suffering, the seizure of Quebec had fundamentally broken the spine of New France. The city was the cork in the bottle of the St. Lawrence. By holding the Narrows, the British controlled the flow of goods, weapons, and information into the interior of the continent. The French forces remaining in Montreal were cut off from France. When the ice finally broke in the spring of 1760, the eyes of both armies turned to the river, scanning the horizon for the first sails. If French ships arrived first, the British garrison would be overwhelmed. If British ships arrived, New France was doomed. The arrival of the frigate HMS Lowestoft in May signalled the end. It was British. The geography of the sea lanes now favoured the Royal Navy's global dominance. The French army, trapped in the interior without resupply, had no choice but to capitulate. The fall of Montreal followed, but it was the capture of the heights of Quebec that had made the end inevitable. The cliffs had been the key. Once turned, the door to the continent could not be closed again. The reverberations of the musket fire exchanged on the plains of Abraham did not stop at the banks of the St. Lawrence. They rolled across the Atlantic, reshaping the geopolitical map of the world. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris formalized what the geography of Quebec had already dictated. New France was no more. The vast territory stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico passed into British hands. The Gibraltar of North America had fallen, and with it, the dream of a French empire on the continent. But the legacy of the battle is not just a change of flags. It is a testament to how the physical world shapes human destiny. The victory at Quebec removed the French threat from the northern border of the American colonies. No longer needing British protection from New France, the American colonists began to chafe under British taxes and control, setting the stage for the American Revolution just a decade and a half later. In a bitter twist of irony, the British success in navigating the St. Lawrence planted the seeds for the loss of their southern colonies. The geography that secured Canada helped lose America. Today, the Anse-au-Foulon, the site of Wolfe's audacious ascent, is a quiet cove, overshadowed by the industry of modern Quebec. The cliffs still rise steep and imposing, though they are now covered in the tangled greenery of neglect rather than the tension of war. To the modern eye, they still look impossible, a vertical barrier that defies logic. Standing at the base and looking up, one can almost hear the ghostly scrape of boots on rock and the heavy breathing of the Highlanders dragging themselves toward destiny. It remains a physical monument to the concept that in war, the impossible is only impossible until someone is desperate enough to try it. The Plains of Abraham have undergone an even more profound transformation. The killing field where Montcalm and Wolfe met their ends is now a serene urban park. Joggers run where lines of infantry once stood. Children play on the grass that once drank the blood of empires. It is a peaceful landscape scar on the city's face. Yet, beneath the manicured lawns and the monuments, the geography remains unchanged. The plateau still commands the river. The heights still dominate the view. The land has not forgotten, even if the people have moved on. The siege of Quebec serves as an enduring reminder that history is not merely the product of great men and their decisions. It is a negotiation between human will and the immutable facts of the earth. Wolfe's genius was not in overpowering the French army, but in unlocking the puzzle of the landscape. Montcalm's failure was not a lack of courage, but a misplaced faith in the infallibility of nature. The river, the tides, the cliffs, and the winter, these were the true belligerents. As we look back on the events of 1759, we are reminded that while armies march and empires rise and fall, the land remains. The St. Lawrence still churns through the treacherous traverse. The Cap Diamant still looms over the water, silent and watchful. In the end, the geography fought harder than the armies, and it was the geography that decided who would inherit the continent. The British conquered the rock, but the rock defined the nation that would emerge from the smoke. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the pivotal siege of Quebec and the role geography played in shaping history, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did Wolfe get lucky, or was it pure genius? Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing from the front lines of history. Thanks for watching.